Dr. Layne Norton. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Before we jump in, I want to get your stance on what constitutes evidence. Because I think a big reason why you are considered one of the, if not the most trusted person in the realm of nutrition and training is that you set a very high bar for what you consider science-based fact that motivates action. So to just kind of break this down based on my read of the landscape online, it seems that there's a group of people, I don't know what to call them, purists or something, who unless there's a randomized controlled trial, so that means in humans, or several, that points in a particular direction, they are very unlikely to adopt a new practice, say removing a given food or nutrient, adding a given food or nutrient, training a certain way, not training a certain way. Okay, that's one group. Then there are the people who, if they are told something could be of value, they hear it's worked very well for somebody, maybe they see some before and afters, and it gets mapped to a mechanism that exists in humans and animals, like, oh, there's this molecule, and if this molecule increases, X, Y, and Z happens, and training in this way or eating this way increases that molecule, for instance, but no randomized controlled trial, then they're willing to try it or adopt it. And then there's a third, probably a fourth category as well, where people say they don't trust science anyway, science is flawed, or the controls required to design a really good experiment are so constrained that they don't mimic the real world well enough. And so they're really just interested in what works. So they look to people that seem to have achieved the results they want. Feel free to add another group, but which group would you consider yourself in personally? And then where does your evidence that you put out online and today come from? And I already know the answer to the last question, but I think it was important to kind of spell out the landscape.
So everything you just mentioned would fall into the category of evidence. Everything that we can observe is evidence. But I think what people really struggle with is the idea of different levels of quality of evidence. And if I had to put myself into a group, I have definitely been on the side of, well, there's a case study in this journal and we're going to try that now because it must work. Or, my friend tried this and they said it worked, so I'm going to try it. And then I've also gone to the group of, well, there's no human randomized control trial, so I don't believe it. And I think now, I'm 42 now, and I've been doing this for 2 decades. I think where I'd fall into is it really depends on how the individual is talking about the evidence. Okay, so as you can probably imagine, I get sent a lot of stuff for people to debunk this. And a lot of times people will send me things and I'll go, hey, this person said this is their opinion. That's fine. I may disagree with their opinion, but I'm not going to rake them over the coals for them saying this is an opinion or this is my personal experience. That's evidence. It's low quality evidence, but it is evidence. I think I kind of fall in a line of I ideally want to see human randomized control trials, but there's also, as you mentioned, practical limitations with how things are implemented. And I think one of the things that gave me a very unique perspective was the fact that I was doing my PhD in nutrition after I did a bachelor's in biochemistry. So I had that mechanistic understanding. And then I had an absolutely wonderful PhD advisor, Don Layman, who just, shout out to him, got a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Society of Nutrition, 20 years too late. But he was just incredible at being able to understand the small things, but how they impacted the big things and what it looked like overall. It's like a conductor looking at a symphony, right? And understanding how the trumpet sounds affects everything else, but then not getting so tied up in that he can't hear all the music, right? And he was so good at that and was so good at getting me to think that way. And so I think where people out in the landscape trying to dissimulate this really struggle is they don't really know, well, this person decided to study, and they equate that as evidence that's equal with any other evidence, right? And as a researcher, not all evidence is created equal. Not all journal articles are created equal. And honestly, people who don't have a research background, it's hard to unpack this stuff. So What I would say is you have to be very careful with people who cite studies. And one of the things I'll say too is there's nothing more dangerous than somebody who's read a biochemistry book, because they're going to see pathway, biochemical pathway, there must be an outcome. So outcomes are what we really care about, right? At the end of the day, and when I say outcomes, gaining muscle mass, losing fat mass, risk of cardiovascular disease, insulin sensitivity, cancer, right? These are hard outcomes, right? And those outcomes are the summation of dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of biochemical pathways, all summing up to an outcome. And just because something has a biochemical pathway doesn't mean it will create an outcome. But if there's an outcome, there's absolutely a mechanism to explain it. Now, let me give you an example of why this stuff can be so complicated and why it's so easy for people to, if you want to create a narrative, you can always find a study to create a narrative. Aspirin, we would agree, is an anticoagulant. There's a reason they give it to patients who are at risk for heart disease or a heart attack. It's because it reduces blood clots, reduces coagulation. It also activates procoagulant pathways. But the overall outcome is anticoagulation. But if I wanted to create a narrative that aspirin was bad for blood clots, I could say, well, look at these biochemical pathways it activates. And you see this, like, for example, I could create a narrative that smoking is not bad for you. Okay. I remember reading a meta-analysis of the effect of smoking on the risk of adenocarcinoma, right? And there's a forest plot with probably about 50 studies. And most of those studies are to the very far right of the line, which is increases risk. And I think the overall effect was like 300 or 400% increased risk of adenocarcinoma. But there were two studies that were to the left of the line, not by much, and it wasn't statistically significant, but I could say, hey, look, I could cite these two studies, PMID, they showed no increased risk of adenocarcinoma and actually might be slightly protective. And by the way, did you know that smoking decreases the risk of Parkinson's by 30 to 40%? And by the way, that's very consistent in literature.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
So I can start creating this narrative that smoking, but we know smoking's not good for you. It's not good for you. Raises the risk of lung cancer, all different kinds of cancers, cardiovascular disease, massive increase in risk, right? But I could thread the needle of science using these cherry-picked studies. And so what I'll tell people is if I go into a topic, if I go into something, what I'm looking for, highest quality of evidence, is first off, do we have some meta-analyses on this topic?
Do you want to just explain for the general listener what a meta-analysis is? Just in kind of top contour.
Absolutely. So a meta-analysis is basically where you're trying to compile studies that ask similar questions and look at what is the overall effect? Do we have a consensus in the literature? And usually they're going to show some kind of forest plot of all these studies, and however far right or left of the center line is kind of giving you an idea of how powerful the effect was in that study. And then you can see the confidence intervals in terms of how much variability there was. And then you can see the thickness of the dot on there, which shows how much it contributed to the overall analysis by usually how many subjects were in it.
Right. One study with 10 subjects would have a very small dot compared to a subject with 500 subjects.
Exactly. Okay. And so you're trying to, now you can do a bad meta-analysis based on inclusion criteria, and that's where it's important to look at. But let me give you an example of a meta-analysis I cite pretty frequently. The inclusion criteria is very important to make sure that you answer the question that you want to answer. And I say this when you're reading scientific studies. I'm like, listen, just because there's a headline in even a paper, just because the conclusion says something, that is the author's opinion. Okay, you need to check to see, did they actually test what they're talking about? And are the tests they use valid, right? So this meta-analysis was looking at lower carb diets versus higher carb diets or low-fat diets. And the inclusion criteria, this was done by Kevin Hall of the NIH back in 2017, I want to say. And I thought he did a great job at the inclusion criteria, which was, we're only going to include controlled feeding trials where the food is provided to participants, because obviously we know the limitations of, free living studies with nutrition.
Right, self-report. People sneak, people forget.
We are going to make sure that these studies equated calories for the reasons we talk about. You got to compare apples to apples, right? So a lot of studies will come out saying fasting produced more fat loss, low carb produced more, but then they didn't control calories, and it's very likely these people just ate less. So they controlled calories and they controlled protein, which is also important because protein changes the composition of weight loss. Protein has a thermic effect. Protein increases lean mass retention. So that can change how much fat you lose. And I think that also had a requirement of like a minimum of 4 weeks, right? And the outcome was looking at changes in fat mass, not fat oxidation, not energy expenditure. It actually looked at the outcome that they cared about. And they showed no difference, right? So I thought, well, that's a very well done meta-analysis because the inclusion criteria make a lot of sense for the question that they want to answer, which is not, is one diet easier to stick to? Not, is it, more practical? The question was mechanically, do these diets produce differences when we're comparing apples to apples in actual fat loss? And the answer was no, right? So, and then when you look at the other meta-analyses that have been done, they tend to kind of support that, right? So the first thing I'm going to look at is, all right, these meta-analyses tend to be looked at as kind of the highest form of evidence, right? Because you're compiling a bunch of different studies, which, listen, we know there are bad studies that get done. I think the amount of studies that get like just straight up faked is probably much lower than people think. But
one hopes. But
yeah,
I would agree. I think that people make errors. I do think that a lot of quote unquote bad papers, or let's just say false conclusions, arise from elimination of data that did not fit the person's desired outcome. And the reason I say that is I think it's impossible to control for. So you've got the student or postdoc doing the experiment. The results don't come out the way they would have preferred. And then let's just say I've observed before, never in my laboratory, fortunately, but cases where people come up with reasons why that particular experiment wasn't valid because, the mice were initially sick or the lot of drug that they used wasn't, it was heading towards expiration. They come up with reasons to exclude.